All right, well, everyone, welcome to Exodus Church. My name's Kyle. I'm one of the pastors here. And some of you know, I grew up in New England, in New Hampshire. And one of the really cool things about New England, and New Hampshire in particular, is how many old buildings there are. My parents' house was built in the 1880s or something like that, and it's over 100 years old. My dad has remodeled the whole thing over the course of about 30 years. And everywhere you go, you see these old structures. You see these old buildings. And one of my favorite aspects of the old architecture are old churches, right? Because you go to these old churches and you would see these massive stained glass windows. You would see on the floors mosaics, these different tiles put together to make a piece of art. And they're beautiful. And even in town here in Wichita, I've seen some old church buildings with beautiful stained glass windows. And one of the really neat things about stained glass windows is if you walk up close to it and you look at the particular panes of glass, each one is unique and beautiful with the way that they're colored and the way that they're cut. And you could look at all these individuals and say, man, it's just beautiful artistry, right? And then when you step back, you see all of these pieces working together to create a whole piece of art, a stained glass window, and it's even more beautiful in that way. So this morning, as we're in Mark chapter 6, we are going to, instead of looking in at the details of this mosaic, of this stained glass window, and seeing each pane of glass like we normally do on Sundays, we're going to step back and look at the whole window, look at the whole project that Mark is doing in chapter 6. I believe there's a lot of beauty here, and there's a lot of artistry that would be missed if we were to dive into the particulars and the details. So this morning we're going to be in Mark chapter 6, looking at this whole chapter, which is roughly about 56 verses. So we're going to make our way through it. And last week, we were in Mark chapter 5 and had the story of Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. And this really sets the context for this morning. If you remember, both of these women were called daughters. There are two daughters, and both of them were healed. The woman with the issue of blood was healed by reaching out and touching Jesus' robe, his garment, and healing came to her. And Jairus, he came to Jesus looking for a healing for his daughter, yet what Jesus gave him instead was a resurrection. And he was not expecting that, but certainly astounded when it happened. So this sets the context for us this morning. And as we look at chapter 6, we will see not two daughters, but two kings in contrast. Two kings, two shepherds. So we are going to zoom out and look at this from multiple angles, from a wide-angled lens, if you would. So what we find in chapter 6 as well is another sandwich, right? And we saw this last week with Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. And what Mark does with sandwiches is he tells one story. He then switches gears and tells a different story in the middle, which would be like the meat of the sandwich. And then the second part of the sandwich is he returns to that original story. So we see this happening again in Mark chapter 6. But as we work through Mark chapter 6, there's something I want to call your attention to. And if you have been able to come out to the Exodus Institute classes we're doing on Wednesday nights, we've been going through a class on how to read the Bible, right? It's called The Glory of Kings, How to Read the Bible. And one thing that we have to constantly look at when we're reading the Bible is to look for patterns, right? The Bible is written in some wonderful and complex but beautiful patterns. And there is a pattern here in chapter 6 that I'd like to call your attention to. So there are 6 movements in this chapter. So I want to try to set out the pattern, the outline, call your attention to it, and then we'll walk through it and see how this pattern replays a couple different times. But there's 6 movements. The first one is we see a resurrection, and that's a context of chapter 5 with Jairus' daughter. We then see a rejection. We then see a sending. then a feeding, then a crossing, and finally a healing. All right? A resurrection, rejection, sending, feeding, crossing, and healing. And this pattern will help us understand what's going on in chapter 6, but it'll also shed light on what God is doing even throughout history. All right? So first, we want to, we come out of the resurrection last week, and we want to focus in on the rejection. So the rejection we see in the first few verses of chapter 6, and I'm not going to read every verse, but I'll walk through the chapter and kind of explain the pattern, if you would. So after Jesus leaves Jairus' house with his apostles, he had 3 with him, James, John, and Peter, and they're all in Jairus' house, and they leave, and they say, okay, let's go. So they go, and they get together with the other 12 apostles, and they all go to Nazareth. Nazareth is where Jesus was born, right? This is the place where Jesus learned to walk. He learned to talk. He played there. It was in Nazareth where he learned to be a carpenter. When there was family reunions, he would go back to Nazareth where his 4 brothers and his mom and his sisters, they all lived in Nazareth. In fact, in chapter 3, we see Jesus' mom, Mary, and his brothers come from Nazareth to Capernaum to talk to Jesus, saying, you've lost your mind, right? Because Jesus was healing people and he hadn't eaten and all of this. So they came to rebuke him in sorts. And then they went back to Nazareth, and now Jesus and his disciples go there. So he goes home, and there's no mention of Joseph, Jesus' dad, and nobody really knows what happened to Joseph, but more than likely he passed away years before this, and he really doesn't have a role in these sort of stories where we see Jesus' family coming together. So we look at, we're in the context of Nazareth. Jesus goes home, sees his mom and his brothers and his sisters, and then on the Sabbath he goes into the synagogue to teach. He goes into the synagogue, and we see this in chapter 6, verses 2 and 3. It says, and on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? Where did he get these things? They've never heard this sort of teaching. What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. You know, so you have Jesus going home. He goes into the synagogue, and he preaches a powerful sermon. And everybody says, listen, we remember you, Jesus, when you were a kid. And now you go away for a while, and you come back, and you think you have the right to talk to us this way. You think you have the right to speak the truth of the law, or in their minds, to expound upon or preach the Old Testament. And you do so with authority. That's been the piece all the way out throughout the Gospels. We see Jesus having this kingly authority when he opens up the Word. And now the people he grew up with take an offense to him. They're offended by this. And more than likely because the content of Jesus' sermon was not tickling their ears, but rather convicting their hearts. Right? And this is something that's interesting about Jesus. It seems to be wherever he goes, people get offended. People get offended when the truth of the gospel is proclaimed. And for us as followers of Christ, we ought not be concerned about offending people with the truth of the gospel. If we try to make this powerful declaration of Jesus' kingship and how he came to bring everything into submission to himself, if we try to make that palatable to people, then we lose the essence of the gospel. Right? The gospel is offensive, is what Paul says in his epistles. So we see that they take offense to him because he preaches the gospel. Then Jesus goes on to say in verse 4, and Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. So Jesus is saying, I'm a prophet. I travel all around Capernaum and Galilee and the greater Jerusalem and Israel, and I am not without honor because he preaches with power and authority. Yet, when I go home, there's no honor for me. So Jesus left the synagogue, and he says that he went out among the villages teaching. And when he did this, he gathered to himself the 12 apostles and gave them marching orders. And Jesus isn't going to be the only one to preach. In fact, he is saying that he is gathering his apostles together in order for them to be sent out to proclaim the same truth that was so offensive in the synagogue. So he sends them out on a mission. He sends them. And this brings us to that second movement in the pattern: resurrection, rejection. Jesus was rejected in his hometown. And now to the sending. And we see this in verses 6 through 13. It says here, "And he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2. And he gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. And he said to them, whenever you enter a house, stay there until you depart from there. And if any place will not receive you, and they will not listen to you," kind of like what happened to me back in Nazareth at the synagogue, "if that happens to you, when you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and proclaimed that the people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them. So we see here, Jesus now gathers his disciples together, which is the whole purpose of the calling of the disciples in chapter 3. When Jesus calls them together, it says that he called these 12 so that he might send them out to proclaim. Right? So now he's doing that. He's doing the sending piece, which is interesting to think about. When God calls people, he calls them for a purpose, which is to send them. And that's not unique to the disciples, right? That's for all of us. Jesus calls us to himself so that he might send us to proclaim this same message that is offensive to the ears of the people who don't want to hear. So we see that he sends them out 2 by 2. Why 2 by 2? What's the big deal here? Now, we think of 2 by 2. Zach mentioned this last week. It reminds us of Noah's Ark, right? The animals coming in 2 by 2. God tends to do things oftentimes in the context of community, right? Jesus understands the power of having multiple people going out together, and there's many reasons why this would be strategic, but the first would be just that, community. It is very easy to get discouraged when we are on mission by ourselves, right? It is very easy to get discouraged. It is very easy to get fearful and not want to proclaim something that could be offensive, right? We have all experienced that to one degree or another, to say, man, I really wish my friend was here. I really wish my wife or my husband or my brother or my sister, I wish they were here with me, because then I feel like we could engage this situation with a little bit more boldness. There's nothing wrong with that. This is inherent within the way God created us. He created us for community. Likewise, sending out 2 by 2, you have multiple testimonies. Multiple testimonies. So what one apostle might say to somebody, he then has somebody else to back it up. And there's power in that. Then, of course, encouragement as well. You know, you walk out of a difficult situation where perhaps you were embarrassed, you became tongue-tied, and you couldn't say what you wanted to say, you're feeling down. You have somebody with you to encourage you. This is all real-life stuff. You see, Jesus was not so much concerned about his disciples going out and proclaiming a flawless systematic theology, which is, irrefutable with logic or philosophy or anything else. He is more interested in saying, listen, I want you to go together. I want you to take a staff with you. I don't want you to take any food or any money or anything in your belt. I want you to put sandals on your feet and just go. It's very earthly. It's reality. We can relate to this, right? They're going out and they're nervous, but at the same time excited, because Jesus, the one who they have seen raise this little girl from the dead, has now just sent them, commissioned them to go and proclaim. He tells them not to take or he tells them to take a staff. And why would he tell them to take a staff? This is the interesting thing, right? If you say, why a staff? And when you think about the power of staffs throughout the Bible, there is a constant connection with being a shepherd's staff. As Pastor Zach read in Psalm 23 this morning, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So Jesus is saying, listen, you 12 apostles, I am now sending you out as the new shepherds for Israel. I'm sending you out not just to proclaim, but I am calling you to be shepherds to the sheep because they are lost and without a shepherd at this time. And we'll get into that in a little while. So they take the staff with them to symbolically represent, yes, we are shepherds, and the people who are scattered amongst Nazareth and Galilee and so on, these are sheep who are lost. He tells them to wear their sandals. Why is this? Well, Moses was an interesting character in the Old Testament, which Mark builds so much of his gospel around the story of Moses. Moses, likewise, had a staff. He did a lot of incredible things with it, right? He struck the Red Sea and it turned to, or the Nile and it turned to blood. Also struck the Red Sea and it parted, right? He used his staff to go to war with the wizards or the sorcerers in Egypt, and it became a snake. So this staff has some power to it. But if you remember, when God called Moses, when he was a shepherd tending sheep out in the fields, he called him into his presence and he said, take off your sandals, for where you are standing is holy ground. So I think what Jesus is saying here is, listen, this is not yet holy ground. This is not mine. My presence, my kingship does not reign here, which is why I need shepherds to go out. And this is why you're putting on your sandals. You have your staff. You are ready to go. You're ready for action. This is actually the same wardrobe and the same equipment that Moses told the fathers to be wearing right before the Passover. It says, as you eat this last meal, eat with your staff in hand, eat with your belt on, and eat with your sandals, because the Lord is coming. So they're ready to go. So it's the same posture, the same equipment for these new shepherds, sandals and staff, and likewise their belt. But in their belt, there's no food or money or bags. So Jesus is saying, for one, I am sufficient for you. There's no confidence in this mission based off how much money you have, how much food you might have. There's no confidence in these things, but rather go with the confidence of Christ. And likewise, when they're gone, he says, and also stay at people's homes. Let generosity take care of you. Right? He's saying that the generosity of others is to help support these apostles who have now given their lives to ministry, given their lives to Jesus. Saying, listen, you don't make any money doing this. So now let the people support you. And if they don't support you, then shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. And this testimony against them is some harsh language, which is basically to say, if they reject you, they also reject me. And if that's the case, dust off the dirt from your feet as a testimony against them, which is really to say the curse is still upon you. You have not been freed from this. You remember in Genesis, the curse was for the serpent to what? To become like a snake and to eat dust, essentially. Right? Now, what does Adam have to do? He has to toil in the dirt, in the ground. This idea of dust and dirt is it represents the curse of sin and death. So if nobody accepts them, they basically wipe it off and says, the curse remains. We're going to let this dust and this dirt stay here because you have just rejected your king. And it is not just a king like Herod is a king. This is the king that can save your souls. So this is why they dust off their feet. And then it says that they anointed people with oil. And oil throughout the Bible is this picture of God's presence, of his holiness, of his glory. So when they would go out with oil and anointed people and healed them, this was symbolically like Jesus was going with them. The anointed one was going with them. So this is the sending. Jesus sends these apostles out. And then when they return, which we see happening in verse 30. Now between verse 13 and verse 30, we have the account of John the Baptist. All right, this is that middle section to the sandwich. And now we're going to skip over this section and come back to it in just a moment. But the mission picks up again on the second side of this sandwich in verse 30 when they come back and they tell Jesus of everything that they did. Said, Jesus, you won't believe it. We did what you said. We anointed people with oil and they were healed. We cast out demons. We proclaimed your truth and people accepted us. And it was amazing. And they're all excited about the things that they had just done. Right? We see this in verse 30. It says the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Now Jesus realizing, okay, this takes a lot out of you. He realizes they're tired, so he says in verse 31, and he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Again, just very, very practical, right? This Jesus is very concerned about the normal aspects of life. Yeah, we're exhausted. We've been traveling around, preaching, casting out demons, and we've had no time to really sit back and eat or even talk with each other. So Jesus, concerned about that, says, listen, let's get some time together. He says, follow me, and they go to this desolate place. Now, Mark is an interesting writer in his gospel because he does not pay a lot of attention or cares much about details. And we've seen that throughout. He flies through so many of these narratives, these stories that other gospel writers, particularly Matthew and Luke, they'll camp out and they'll give you all the ins and outs and what people were doing, what they're saying, what the environment was like. Mark doesn't do that. Except for when he does, then we need to pay attention. And that's what he does here. It says that, come away by yourselves to a desolate place. This word desolate means a wilderness. It's the same sort of wilderness that the Israelites were wandering around for 40 years after the Exodus. So Jesus is saying, come with me to this desolate place, and let's relax. Let's eat together. Let's talk. So in verse 32, we see, and they went away in the boat to what? A desolate place by themselves. Mark repeats it again. He wants us to pay attention to this. Verse 33, now many saw them going and recognized, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So these people that they're trying to get away from, they get into this boat to go to this desolate place. The people see where they're going. All right, they're going over here. Let's go. So they all run to meet Jesus and the disciples on the other side. So they cross over, and in verse 34 it says, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. They're all waiting for him. Not much rest in this story. And he had compassion on them. This is Jesus again, having compassion on these people, even though they're the same people he's trying to get away from just for a little while. Unlike myself, I would not have compassion on people that I'm trying to get away from. They keep following. Jesus looks at him and says, man, he has compassion. He has the heart of a good shepherd. He has compassion on them. He goes on in 34, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. They were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. So here we see a connection now with the first half of that story where Jesus tells the apostles to go out with their shepherd staff, right? So now we see that the people are like sheep, and they are without a shepherd. And now Jesus has compassion. He begins to teach them many things. And in verse 35, and when it grew late, the disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place. Again, 3 times. And the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. The disciples are ready for the people to leave as well. They want to eat. They want to relax. So they're saying, send the people away, and then they can get them their own food, and we can have some time together and relax. Verse 37. But he answered, this is Jesus speaking now, you give them something to eat. Us? We've just been out preaching. We've been doing all of these things. Now you want us to give them something to eat? And by the way, Jesus, have you forgotten where we are? We're in a desolate place. There's no food here. There's no fruit trees. This is the desert. This is sand and rock. You give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? This is a lot of money and a lot of bread. And we'll see how much in just a moment. Verse 38, he goes on. And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they returned. We have 5 and 2 fish. 5 loaves, 2 fish. Then he commanded them to all sit down in groups on the green grass. Wait a second. Mark has just told us 3 times that this is a desolate place. Now he's saying, have them sit down on the green grass. There's something that doesn't quite mix here, unless you're Jesus, unless we've been following what Mark has been doing, what he's been proclaiming about this king, what he's come to do, enter into a desolate place and recreate it so it begins to look more like heaven. This shepherd who says, my sheep will not be wandering in a desolate place, but rather I will bring them to green pastures. This is Jesus now in the desolate place of the wilderness, of the desert. And what is he doing? He is creating a garden. He's creating a new Eden. He is showing them, I will do this everywhere. See the green grass. This doesn't fit in this passage. And Mark wants us to see this and say, oh my gosh, how is it that they're sitting on green grass in this rugged, desolate desert? It's because when Jesus is present, he recreates things, right? He recreates us. He recreates humanity. He recreates families and relationships and so on. And ultimately, the hope of the gospel is he will one day recreate all things. All the deserts will be gone, and the whole world will be a new garden. You want to talk about patterns? This is the entire Bible, right? It starts with a garden, sinless perfection in the presence of God, and it ends with a garden, sinless perfection in the presence of God. Yet this garden in Revelation has now grown to not only be an Eden, but it is cosmic. It is worldwide. It is a new creation. So here we see just a sample of this. So they sat down, verse 40, in groups by hundreds and by 50s, which also matches up what happened when the Israelites left Egypt in groups of hundreds and 50s as they were going out in the Exodus. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. And he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. 5,000 men, probably roughly 15,000 people with women and children. This is an incredible miracle. This is an incredible testimony to the power of Jesus, that he not only is a shepherd to his sheep, he not only takes his sheep from desolate places to green pastures, but he also provides and feeds them as well. So this is the feeding that we see. So we had the resurrection, the rejection, the sending, go out and preach, and now the feeding. And now we move to the crossing. The crossing takes place in the very next story, starts in verse 45, and we see that Jesus takes the disciples back to the water and say, okay, get in the boat, you guys go, and I will meet you wherever. It doesn't tell us. But Jesus wants to go and pray. So Jesus goes up onto the mountain to pray, which again, we see a lot of similarities with the Exodus story, how Moses went up onto the mountain as the people were waiting. So he sends his disciples across. And then the disciples are having a very difficult time getting across the sea because there is a great headwind, right? It says that they are exhausted. They are beat up from this wind. They are unable to make it across. The seas are not calm. They're not still. They're rugged, and they are moving quickly in the wrong direction. So now they're trying and they're trying. And it was evening when he fed them, and now it's the third watch, which is between 3 and 6 a.m., which the disciples are still out there, tired, exhausted, worn out. And Jesus comes to them, and he passes by them as they are on the water. and they look out and they're all afraid because they think Jesus is a ghost, until Jesus comes and he tells them not to be afraid, and he gets in the boat, and what happens? The waters become still, and then he is able to bring them to the other side. And then when they get to the other side, we see that we move to the next section in this pattern, which is the healing, and that many people came to him. Many people from all over came, and they were healed. And it even makes reference to they were healed in the same way as the woman with the issue of blood was healed. They were healed by just touching his garments. This is what Jesus does, right? He heals his people. Where he goes, he brings healing not only to the land, desolate place, and then to a grassy place, but even to people who were sick, and now, when they touch Jesus, they are healthy. So we see this powerful story in this pattern: resurrection, rejection, a sending, a feeding, a crossing of the sea, and then ultimately a healing. And this pattern now has brought us all the way through chapter 6, and we see this pattern now replayed in the middle of that sandwich of chapter 6 in the story of John the Baptist's martyrdom, his beheading. Now, this story is, I think, probably the grittiest and most vile story in Mark's gospel, and perhaps the New Testament as a whole. So I'm going to spare you the details and speculation of what could have been going on here, but want to show you this pattern and how it continues through even this middle section of chapter 6. So this is a story of John the Baptist. Now, we last heard about John the Baptist all the way back in chapter 1, which Mark tells us that he was arrested, and then from there, Jesus begins his ministry. In fact, this is almost a fulfillment of prophecy of John and John the Baptist in the Gospel of John, where he says, I must decrease so that he must increase. Jesus must be made much of, I must become less. So how much less can you be when you're locked into a prison? And it was Herod who arrested him. Now, this section here, this is not in chronological order with the original story. Mark inserts this story for a reason. And we're going to hopefully find out what this reason is, but to realize that he was arrested and killed well before the crossing of the Red Sea or the feeding of the 5,000 or the sending out of the apostles. But Mark inserts a story here. In verse 14, it says, King Herod heard of it. Now, what is it that he has heard of? Well, the previous verse says that, so they went out, this is talking about that sending, proclaiming that the people should repent, and they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed, and they healed him. So Herod has heard about what the apostles are doing. He has heard of this Jesus figure, and he wants to know, well, who is this? Who is this Jesus? Why is he so important? Why are people flocking to him? Why are people now being sent out from him and doing miracles as well? So when he heard about it, heard about all that Jesus and his followers were doing, some told him it's John the Baptist, and he was raised from the dead. This is that resurrection piece in that pattern. He was raised from the dead. Others told him that it was Elijah, and others said it was a prophet of old. So now Herod is very curious, who is this Jesus? But it doesn't go into his line of thinking, and rather it goes right back to the fear that he has that John has been raised. And then Mark tells us the story of why Herod has this fear. Right? He is fearful of John because of the way in which John died. You see, John and Herod, they actually began to have a little bit of a relationship with each other before he was arrested. John was a preacher proclaiming the gospel, and Herod knew that John was a holy and righteous man, and he was fearful of him. Yet, Herod was very inclined to the way John preached. He liked to hear John preach. We see this in verse 20. Verse 20 says, For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. Right? So Herod wanted to protect John because he didn't want John to come back as a righteous and holy man and somehow have revenge on him if he didn't treat him well. And then it says, when he heard him, this is heard him preach, he was greatly perplexed. Herod listens to John. Man, this guy doesn't really make sense to me, but it's interesting. And then it says, and he listened to him gladly. He heard him gladly. So this is Herod, this king, and this itinerant preacher that's going around, and he goes, I don't really believe anything you're saying. I don't understand what you're saying, but I love listening to him. And I know he's a righteous and holy man. In fact, this kind of reminded me of the relationship between Benjamin Franklin and George Whitefield. George Whitefield was a preacher who would travel around during the Great Awakening, right? You had this resurgence of Christianity, and Whitefield would travel all throughout really up and down the East Coast. And Benjamin Franklin, who he created his own Bible. Do you remember? He cut out like the sections of the Bible that he didn't like, and then he had the Benjamin Franklin Bible. Does not love God, does not hold to Christ, does not pay allegiance to Jesus. Yet, when George Whitefield came around, he loved to hear him preach. In fact, he said he would go to these revivals that Whitefield would hold, and he would intentionally leave his money at home because the last time he went, he was compelled to give a little bit of money, and he goes, okay, I can't give any more. And then Whitefield would continue to preach, so he'd give more money. Eventually, he gave everything he had. So the next time he goes to hear Whitefield preach, he says, I'm not bringing my wallet. I don't want to give him all my money. And as Whitefield started preaching, that basket came along. Benjamin Franklin reached in, took out his pocket watch, and dropped it in and said, I got to give him something, right? He is this good of a preacher. And this is similar to the relationship between Herod and John. I don't believe anything he's saying, but I love hearing him preach. So they built this relationship, and ultimately what ended up happening is John, being a righteous and holy man, saw what Herod was doing in his personal life. And what Herod did was he took his brother's wife, Herodias, to be his own. Right? And we don't know the details of how that all played out. We don't know if he killed his brother. We don't know if there was this they were both married to her. We're not really sure exactly the details, but what John knew is this is not right. So John went up against Herod and told him and rebuked him, saying, this is not right what you have done. And Herod he liked him. He goes, well, I'm king. There's nothing you can do about it. But Herod's new wife, Herodias, hated it. She was offended. She was offended in the same way that the people in Nazareth were offended by the gospel. So Herodias rejected that. So we see the resurrection, John the Baptist coming back from the dead. That's the fear that Herod had. And now Herodias, when hearing John preach the truth, rejects that and says, no, 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 kill this man. And Herod says, I'm not going to kill him. I'll throw him in jail. Which is an interesting thing, right? Ultimately, John was killed because he held to a biblical view of marriage. And for us today, we say, wow, this is how important it is, right, to the church, that God has instituted marriage, and there is a way in which marriage ought to look, and we ought to stand for that in the same way that John did. He saw that this was a perversion of what God had intended in marriage, and ultimately, he lost his head over it. So they reject him, they send him to prison. And then Herod has a party on his birthday, and he invites all of his friends over. And his daughter, the daughter of Herodias and his daughter, about 12 years old, there's a connection in age with Jairus' daughter, who is 12, and this little girl here. She's dancing for Herod and for all of his friends, and they were so impressed with her dancing that Herod called her over and says, I am so impressed with this. I love the way you dance. I will give you anything, up to half of my kingdom. Now this little girl, 12 years old, says, I don't know what am I supposed to do with that? So she goes and asks her mom, Herodias, who hates and rejected John the Baptist, said, what should I ask for? And Herodias tells her, ask for John the Baptist's head on a platter. That's what we want. So this little 12-year-old girl goes back to King Herod and says, I want John the Baptist's head brought out on a platter. So now Herod is upset about this, grieved, but he doesn't want to embarrass himself. He doesn't want to break this vow, this oath he made to this little girl in front of all of his friends, which is there's some irony there too, right? I mean, he has no problem breaking marriage vows, but he doesn't want to break this vow to this 12-year-old girl in front of his friends, right? Priorities are completely upside down with this man. So he says, all right, I'll do it, though he wasn't happy about it. So he sends the executioner to the prison cell. And this word send is the exact same word that Jesus uses, or that Mark uses for Jesus when he sends the disciples out. You see, Jesus sends his disciples out to heal and to cast out demons and to proclaim righteousness. Herod, the bad king, the bad shepherd, he sends out executioners to destroy people. There's a huge contrast here. You know, when people rejected Jesus, they rejected him because of his preaching. And when Herod and Herodias rejected John, they likewise rejected him because of his preaching. So now we see that they have sent out the executioner. The executioner goes to the jail cell and executes John the Baptist by beheading him. He puts his head on a platter and he brings it back into this party, this feast with Herod and all of his friends, this birthday party, and they actually serve his head on a platter, which is symbolic of saying we will feed now on John the Baptist. There is a feeding here. Jesus feeds 5,000 lost, scattered sheep. Herod feeds his friends with the lost sheep, the sheep who lost his life. There's this huge contrast. Jesus feeds to bring life. John the Baptist feeds as a symbol of death. So we see this pattern continuing. Ultimately, John crossed over from life to death. That's the crossing, and we see that instead of a healing, he now looks forward to a resurrection, like Jairus' daughter. Okay? And now, this pattern has replayed itself. Mark has structured this chapter to see resurrection, rejection, sending, feeding, crossing, and healing yet again. And one of the reasons he does this is because Mark is acutely aware of how God does things in the Bible. Because this pattern is the same pattern we see in the Exodus story and in the conquest of God's people. When the people of God crossed the Red Sea, there was, in symbolic terms, a resurrection. They went from death to life. They went from slavery to freedom. They walked through the waters of death to come out on the other side alive, a new people, a new birth, a new resurrection, a new creation. We then see them walking in the wilderness, and it didn't take long at all before the people rejected Moses because they were hungry. You remember that? They grumbled against him. They actually wanted to see Moses die. They rejected God's prophet. And they get beyond that. Moses strikes the rock, and the water comes out, and God takes care of them. As a good shepherd, he takes care of his sheep, even though they act out. We then see Moses sending out 12 spies to look at the promised land. In the same way, Jesus sent out 12 apostles to proclaim the kingdom. We then see the people of God fed by God in the wilderness, where he brought manna down from heaven and quail. And the people of God were fed in the same way Jesus fed the 5,000. We also see Moses taking the people of God to the edge of the Jordan River, unable to cross because on the other side is the promised land, and Moses was not to go across. So he brings them up to the edge, and then he sends them across. In the same way that Jesus brought his disciples up to the edge of the water and sent them across, but he didn't go himself. And Joshua is the one that went, and Joshua is the one that parted the Jordan, and the people went through. And in the same way, Jesus is the new Joshua, because though the people could not make it, the disciples couldn't make it on the boat, he goes out and brings them across to the place of healing, the promised land. This pattern replays itself time and time again. And this pattern replays itself even in our relationship with Jesus on a personal level. Jesus is your resurrection. If you have faith in Christ, you have been born again, and you look forward to that ultimate resurrection. And you will be with him, as Paul says in Colossians, in his resurrection. Jesus was rejected so you don't have to be. Jesus was rejected on the cross. He bore the sins of his people on the cross. He was treated the way we were supposed to be treated, which is exiled away from God's presence. See that Jesus is the one who, when he saves us, he sends us as he sent the apostles. We see that Jesus is the one who feeds us. Each week when we come to the table, we remember this, that we get to, not only does he feed us, but he feeds us in his presence. We feed with him on Christ. And Jesus is the one who crossed over from life to death in order to bring us from death to life. And ultimately, Jesus is the one that's going to heal the nations. He's going to heal all things. All death, pain, tears will be gone because Jesus is the good shepherd who loves his sheep. He is the good shepherd that takes care of his sheep. He feeds them. He sacrifices. He does all the things necessary for his sheep. And we see this in Psalm 23, and I love that Zach read through it this morning. We see that this whole passage fits, even in Psalm 23, yet another pattern. It says, Psalm 23 starts off, the Lord is my shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. Jesus has already said, they are sheep without a shepherd. So what does he do? He becomes their shepherd. John 10 says that Jesus is the good shepherd. He sends the apostles out to be shepherds for a lost and dying world. Jesus is our shepherd. And the prophet Ezekiel prophesies concerning this account in Jesus' life in Ezekiel 34, where he contrasts a good shepherd and a bad shepherd. He says, Son of man, or the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. This would be against the Herods, if you would. Prophesy and say to them, even to the shepherds, thus says the Lord God, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat and you clothe yourselves in the wool. This is the shepherds who are killing the sheep. This is Herod. He killed John the Baptist. He was the king of the Jews. He was supposed to be their shepherd. Yet he has become a shepherd like Ezekiel prophesies in chapter 34, that you feed yourself on the sheep. You slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. You do not do the feeding, you feed on them. The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed. This is exactly what Jesus does, right? He gives strength to the weak. He brings healing to the sick as the good shepherd. The injured you have not bound up. The strayed you have not brought back. Again, this is Jesus. The lost you have not sought. And with force and harshness you have ruled them. Jesus is the good shepherd. He goes and gets us. He is kind with us. He brings us in. So they were scattered. Just like Jesus says, these are sheep without a shepherd. Because they have no shepherd, and they become food for all the wild beasts. Now, how does this passage now begin to describe Herod? Because when we do not live according to our design, we do not live as truly human in the image of God, we end up living like beasts, wild beasts, which is what Herod ended up becoming, a beast. My sheep, he says, were scattered. Verse 6, they wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. My sheep were scattered over the face of the earth, with none to search or seek for them. Now Jesus, the good shepherd, comes, and he seeks and he searches for the lost. Not just in Jerusalem, not just in Wichita, but across the globe, to all the nations. Jesus is gathering his sheep to himself. He is the good shepherd. David goes on in the psalm. He says, I shall not want. The people were hungry, yet who fed them? Jesus. They were no longer want. They were satisfied. They were filled up with the gifts of God, the bread and the fish. He's our good shepherd who takes care of our needs. My friends, you are not in want. You have Jesus. There is no want in your life. There's nothing, when your eyes are focused on Christ, there is nothing that will even begin to compare for what Christ has to offer you, right? He is not leaving you lacking. He has not left you without all that you need. And there is stuff that, of course, we say, well, I want this, I want that, I want this. Yeah, but when we focus on Christ, our desires become his desires. And we say, all I want is Christ, right? Like the song we were singing, he is the king of my heart. If he is reigning as king, then he provides for his people. He is the good shepherd. He goes on, David does in Psalm 23, he says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. What did Jesus do with his people but bring them from the desolate place and created green pastures for them to lay down on? He leads me beside the still waters. The disciples were in the boat alone, and the waters were anything but still until Jesus comes and he gets in the boat, and then the waters become still. And he led them across the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name is sake. For his glory, he leads me in paths of righteousness. He sends us out, but he does not send us out alone, right? He doesn't only send us out, but he sends us out and then he leads us as we go. This was the anointing piece that the disciples did. They went and they anointed, bringing symbolically Christ with them and anointing people with the anointed one. And now Jesus, he leads us and he sends us. He goes on, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, if we look at what Mark has done in this passage, and we were to create a 3D puzzle, we would see that Jesus, there's a resurrection, right? There's a rejection, there's a sending, and then right in the middle, that takes up most of the chapter, there is death. There is a killing. There is this horrific evil. And then it's followed by what? A desolate place. So if you were to see this in a 3D puzzle, there's something casting a shadow over this next story, and that's the death of John the Baptist. And now Jesus is, or what David says, is he will walk with us through the valley of the shadow of death. These people were in the shadow of John's death, both in the structure of the text, but also Jesus is doing this in Herod's land, right? This is Herod's territory at this point. And now Jesus is feeding people in the shadow of death. And yet David says, I will fear no evil. I will not fear Herod. I will not fear Herodias. I will not fear to stand up for what John stood up for, a proper view of marriage, or any other thing that aligns us with God. We are not afraid to do this because he is with us, as Jesus was with his people. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with the oil. My cup overflows. Those baskets were overflowing with bread, right, and fish. The disciples anointed people with oil. And then you prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. Jesus fed 5,000 people in Herod's territory. He prepared a table in the presence of their enemies. He says, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And this is the hope, that when we cross over through those waters of death to life, there is healing, and we will be present with him for all eternity. We will take part in this resurrection. We'll have a resurrection in Christ, and we will not be rejected by God because Jesus was rejected for us. He is now sending us on mission to advance his kingdom so all the earth begins to look more like heaven. He then will lead us across those waters of death to the other side where we will receive complete healing. And he feeds us, and he takes care of us. He is our resurrection. He was rejected for us. He does send us. He will feed us. He will bring us across, and ultimately the Christian hope is we will have complete healing at the foot of the cross in the arms of Christ. Let's pray.